Welcome all to the Viking celebration of Portugal. I'm Dr. Sherry Hutt, here to transport you in the next hour to a place and time from whence comes fabulous port wine. From Oporto, the city that gave its name to Portugal, although the royals celebrated in Lisbon. And I'll tell you straight up front that disconnect between the royals and the rest of the people adds a bit of spice and drama to the tension of this story. But if we look at this picture of Oporto, fabulous dense city, we see that it starts on the river Douro and it goes uphill. It's a very vertical city from the people on the docks to the top, and at the top is the church. The church is the power center of the city. There's actually a number of churches in this very Catholic city, but Oporto is a compressed city based on its lifeline on the Douro River. And it grew as the commerce grew from the docks organically upward to the top of the hill. So you'll soon realize in this story that the port wine of today arrives at your table a product of much effort of your benefactor. And so today's story is Forrester and Forrester's perfect port. Forrester arrived as a young man in Oporto in 1831, simply wanting to make fine wine at his uncle's house, his port house. But he found that to make wine required bringing Portugal from a feudal era into the 19th century and creating a market economy where none existed, as well as upending Portuguese tradition in growing grapes, and most of all, define the Royal Oporto Wine Company, which had been chartered in a prior century. So when you think about whether one person can really make a difference, consider that Forrester came to this city as a young man, not a politician, not a royal or a military leader, and yet he fomented a revolution. He created a wine so unique that it needed a new classification, its own classification as port wine. And coincidentally, he brought Portugal into the economic world of Europe. First, let's look at a map to sort of orient ourselves and give context. You see Oporto on the coast up toward the north, divided from Spain by a mountain range as though it's a world unto itself. And I also want to give you a little tour of this city before we go into the story of Forrester to give you some additional context as to the streets Forrester walked and where this wine made such an impact on the entire country of Portugal. If you look at the Douro River, the lifeline of this city, you see all the little yellow markings, the little bridges that brought the people across from the ville, from the city itself, across to the port wine houses. And the ville itself, rather compact, a very small area. In the beginning of our story in 1831, a very tiny area, because Portugal was not a commercial country and this city was not a large commercial center. It became such over the time of our story. And so you can see from the Douro River and the little red dots noting historic points that the Torre dos Clérigos, the tower of the clergy, sits really at the top point of our vertical city. Looking at it today, we notice that it's still an impressive building at the top of the city, the commanding position that the clergy, this is the church of the leaders of the clergy, more powerful in the city than any political people. And so it looks down across the city, impressive today as it was 200 years ago. But down on the docks, where the people brought the barrels of port wine to the port wine houses, where it was bottled and eventually sent to England, mostly to England. This is the domain of the people. And in the photo in the upper right, you see a bridge, modern bridge today, smaller bridges earlier on, but you can see how important the bridges were to connect where the people lived and where the port wine houses are on the other side of the Douro River. So when we look on the mainland side, the shops and the restaurants, looking today as they did in the early 19th century, very few modifications to the streetscape, dense and winding streets organically working their way up from the river, a place of shops and little cafes today. And I'm showing you now across the river as they face the port wine houses where the grapes became wine. Today, port tasting rooms that you would enjoy as you come on your shore tours and go up to the various port wine houses. But note, as they sit today, is how they sat in the early 19th century, but there were fewer of them at the beginning of our story. But you can see some of the names: Offley, Taylor, Fladgate, names in the port wine industry, if you will, today that really took off in the early 19th century. Little close-up of the port wine houses, more of them as our story went on than initially in the beginning of the 19th century, but they grew as a cluster. This is the commercial center, if you will, not only of Oporto, but really of Portugal, because as the royals lived in Lisbon, this was the commercial city. And so, as compact as it is, you can see that Portugal has always had a very small economy. Taking you up the streets before we delve into our story, I want to give you a little walking tour of this lovely, compact city of Oporto, going up through the shops. And you'll notice the various colors. In some traditions throughout the area, when someone was married and they established a home, one of the wedding gifts might be boat paint. And so their homes were painted with boat paint. It was resilient against the weather. And those had a better economy, wanted to display their wealth, would then fascia their homes with tiles. So we go up the street and we pass the customs house, and you can see the customs house here and the waterfront area, Palacio de Bolsa. This is the stock market, that impressive, large, white building that you see. And the picture on the left is the gold room. At some point, there was an economy with textiles, later port wine. But this is the room where the transactions were made, where the money was made, where the merchants who had more money than the king adorned their workspace in gold. And as you look at the customs house, and as you look at the stock market down here on the wharf, the little building to the left, the one that is much indeed of love in this picture, is the old church, the old cathedral, sitting so diminutive next to this commercial structure, and inside, impressive in its own gold interior. Those who made wealth in the markets embellished their churches, because this is indeed a very Catholic country. Before I take you into the story, let's walk further up the hill past the market, the red metal building that you see, and the statue of Prince Henry the Navigator. We'll come back to Prince Henry in a moment. But in the picture of the left, you can see how vertical this city is. As you go up down this little street with the flowers in the front, in the back, there's a staircase that takes you up to a walkway that would then take you across the bridge over to the port wine houses or take you up the street toward the cathedral. So it's a steep climb for most of us to go uphill. And when we step up onto that precipice, you can look above the red roofs and have a fabulous vantage point of the city. The red roofs punctuated by the church steeples because there are so many churches clustered in this very small area. Churches built by wealthy merchants, parish churches, cathedrals over time, all in this very small area. And we look at some of the historic infill as it goes down to the port. And again, you see the colorful houses and those who are displaying their wealth with tiles, fascia on the houses as well. Classic Portuguese domestic architecture. And as we go up at midpoint is the cathedral. Now, the cathedral is of the 15th century, and King Manuel, who started these structures, did not put tiles on his building. Indeed, they're a bit strident, and so the plaza is unadorned, except if you look at the windows. When we look at Portuguese architecture, classic among the buildings is the Manuelian style. King Manuel loved to put his name on just about everything. And so we call this Manuelian style, where the crown is sitting on top of the windows. And throughout Portugal, you'll see this throughout the Portuguese world in Brazil, wherever the Portuguese had a foothold and were building in the 15th, 16th century, you'll see this classic Manuelian architecture. And as we go up the hill, we'll pass a number of the churches. In Portuguese, azul blue, azulejo, blue tile adorning these churches. The benefactors of the churches wishing to show their devotion to the church as well as their individual wealth would commission the tiles. The church on the right is a small parish church, somewhat plain in comparison to the one on the left and some of the other churches, where artists were commissioned to do stories in the tiles, little scenes from daily life in Porto of the time. This church, one of the older ones as we go up the hill, sits to the left of the train station. So the building that you see to the left, the building that you see to the right is of the train station. And above it in the back, that sort of frothy white is the city hall, and we'll come to that in a moment, just to give you an idea how vertical it is as we go up the streets. A few more churches adorned with scenes from life of the time. Each of these sort of vignettes uh, given, commissioned, and adorning the church as a donation from a wealthy benefactor wanting to display their part in the community, until we come to the top, to the clerigos, to the head of the church. And you notice no adornment here in this sort of Italianate regal structure. It's rumored that the church fathers did not put their money into tile because they preferred to have a great wine cellar. As you go up the streets in the city, look down the streets in the older neighborhoods, and there are some of the smaller family chapels. This one, not always open for public inspection, has an interior that is also just adorned by gold, giving some indication of the wealth of this family in the 15th and 16th century. Before I leave this little walking tour, I just want to point out some of the architecture of old Oporto, and then we'll look a little bit at new Oporto, because this is a vibrant, living, evolving city. And as you look at the photo in the center, you see the Manuelian architecture, as I explained it to you. And off to the right, the Spanish inheritance. Spain, at some points in the history of Portugal, Spain controlled the country, although not much to its benefit. And then in the lower left, more of a Baroque, a fancy, high Spanish architecture. This particular building we would call a façadomy, where they've kept the historic structure. It's now a hotel and increased the floor space by adding glass and steel, rising as it is up through the building. In the late 19th century, the Art Nouveau style spread through Paris, and some of that seeped into Portugal. And so we have some buildings, some lovely little structures, notably a bookstore and the Café Majestic. As we come to the top of the hill, as we come closer to the pillar of the Clérigos, because this would be the newer section as we're working our way uphill away from the docks. When we look at Art Nouveau, we're looking at soft lines, sort of flowing curved lines with adornment, a bit fancy. And the other building besides the cafe is the bookstore, Livreria Lello. Now, not so long ago, this appeared on a sort of Instagram snappers, and crowds of people wanted to have their picture taken either in front of or in this building. So they now charge admission to come in and look at the inside. But this is what we would call Portuguese Art Nouveau. Lovely, colorful, soft lines. And the building, the yellow building in the top center, is Art Deco, because Portugal was not immune to the styles that were coming across Europe as we come into the early 20th century, into more of an industrial age, using some of these new techniques, some of these new technologies, not only in the structure, but also in the design. So we move from soft and lovely and colorful Art Nouveau into strident and straight lines of Art Deco. And so the building that you see, as a number of buildings that you'll see in this neighborhood, begin in Art Nouveau, as you see the peacock at the top. But by the time the building was completed, it has its strident lines, its industrial architecture of the 1930s. And the theaters reflect this as well. The National Theater is in the Spanish Baroque style, a la Portugal. But the newer theaters, including the Municipal Theater, is clearly Art Deco. You see the straight lines, even into the lettering, typical Art Deco. And I raise this and I insert this in our story so that you know that Porto, although critical in the history of Portugal and of our story, is of a piece that really brought Portugal into the modern era. But it is a vibrant and evolving city with so many different aspects. Notable is the Portuguese architect of the 19th century, Carlos Amarante, and the building that you're looking at in the upper right is the university. He brought in Spanish arches, but in his own unique style, with the suggested smaller classic windows. And so it's a Spanish style, but in a softer vein. And then we come, as we walk up Avenida de Aliados, the street of the allies, the historian, the heroes, the leaders of the country, the Avenida de Aliados, and we arrive at the top at City Hall, and you see Amarante's architecture there, again with the arches and then the small sort of suggested Spanish Baroque architecture. And there's that frothy government building that we've seen as we've walked up the hill. Statues, both historic and mythical. A little close up, particularly the statue on the right. This is a war memorial where the mythical figure is sitting on time, marking time for those who have served. And when we reach the top, we can then look back down toward the city, back down toward the docks, toward the river, to the bridges of Oporto, where the port wine came from the estates to the port wine houses that then frame our story. One more thing to mention is the funicular, the old funicular made new so that people even today can go from the docks, from the lower area, up the funicular, and then walk across the pedestrian bridge to reach the port wine houses. And lastly, a little bit of the new. I would be remiss if we didn't look at some of the new architecture, the icon commissions of Porto, the Casa de Musica, and the School of Architecture and the Athletic Pavilion that you'll see. The idea is that this is a living city. So we come now to our story, to this critical point in the history of Oporto and of Portugal, and of Porto's namesake export, port wine. As you drink a lovely glass of wine, you should know that it was not always as pleasant as it is today. And we look at our benefactor, Joseph James Forrester. He left England for Oporto in 1831, intent on making fine wine, joining his uncle's business. He saw himself as a businessman, not a visionary, not a revolutionary, but he found it impossible to succeed in Portugal as he found it. The impediment to making quality wine, he quickly found, was the great weight of the Portuguese feudal tradition, so immune to change. Imagine an emerging nation with really no gross domestic product, no market economy. All over Europe, the medieval cloud was giving way to market economies, except in Portugal. So Forrester was more than an aspiring wine exporter. He found that to market quality wine, he first needed to really create a market economy, and wine was that mechanism. Fortunately, he gained some friends, women, vintners, who understood his efforts and worked with him until they amassed some of the largest wine estates in Oporto. But he was also a self-appointed one-man chamber of commerce for the Douro Valley. He would go out with this new tool, the camera, and record the goings on in the valley. And then he would take his pencils and his color paints, and he would paint scenes of the valley, which he would then take back to England to promote port wine, to promote the exports of Portugal. So he became not only a promoter, but also an author, a cartographer. His maps are currently in many of the London archives. As an author, he wrote of what the economy of Portugal could produce if they chose to change the feudal method of production, if they looked at the grapes, if they looked at the way France was making wine, he thought there was so much potential that was simply being overlooked as people fended for themselves in sort of a small independent market, not having an interactive market. What you're looking at here are the ways that the port wine barrels are brought down to Oporto and one of the earliest states. But Forrester wrote of the economy, of what it could be, and the British appreciated this scholarly approach, but the Portuguese were the tougher audience. He took on the ensconced ruling monopolies in an effort to wrestle an entire Portuguese economy into the 19th century. So to truly have an appreciation of Joseph James Forrester's accomplishment, I want to give you a little historic background of the way things were when he arrived. There were really three Englishmen who laid the groundwork for his accomplishments. Two were the Methuens, a father and son team of British ambassadors to Portugal, and the third was Forrester's uncle, who left him an established business. Consider that the Portuguese society that Forrester entered in 1831 was a society that was faced in the past. Prince Henry the Navigator, the royal who knew he would never be king and never left home, launched an age of discovery. He actually held a school for explorers to look at the maps and to be acquainted with whatever the advanced knowledge of the day was in the late 14th, early 15th century. And for 300 years, these discoveries brought back the riches of the world to Portugal. You're looking at a map of Portuguese discoveries by the 16th century. There are some Portuguese colonies, but Portugal was known for establishing a foothold, a market center, a place from which the goods of the world could be brought back to the royals of Portugal, not to the country as a whole, but to the royals. The royals lived in a parallel universe to their subjects, and the subjects basically were in subsistence farms, fending for themselves. So the riches of Africa, Asia, and Brazil were brought back to the Portuguese royals by these explorers who had gone forth over time. And the mountains to the east, the sea to the west and south protected this country from the rest of Europe, but also kept them in their own contained world as the rest of Europe was developing economies and interactive markets. And so at home, Portugal maintained its frozen status with great effort. The royals had rules against domestic markets. They had rules against clothing of colored fabric or any conspicuous ornamentation. And then, of course, in 1492 began the Inquisition that continued on through the 17th century, where they cast out their commercial class of Jews, Moors, and what they termed new Christians that we would call Protestants. Ironically, many Jews settled in Amsterdam and the West Indies, where they became exporters of goods to the English in Portugal and thus enjoyed far better lives living as exiles. The Portuguese back home in Portugal retained the Moorish custom of keeping women sequestered. Women could only go out and socialize on saints' days. And so you'll find when you travel through Portugal that there are 365 saints' days in Portugal. We look at this little gallery of royals at the time that the hero of our story, the benefactor of port wine, Forrester, came to Portugal. For most of the 19th century, the Portuguese monarchy was in flux. In 1807, the Portuguese royals fled from Portugal to Brazil on the onslaught of Napoleon. The queen, known as Queen Mad Maria, passed away at this time, and her husband, King João, became the ruler. The king returned in 1826 after the death of the queen. He then died, leaving no designated heir. Don Miguel was first the regent for Maria, but he usurped Maria so that she wouldn't have to marry her uncle to become queen, and strove to become king of Portugal. Meanwhile, Pedro stayed behind in Brazil, having been given the choice by his father of remaining in Brazil or taking over Portugal. His father suggested that Brazil was the better choice, and so he stayed. That whole episode of their lives is yet another story. Finally, in 1834, Maria became the queen as the last royal standing. So you see, it was a tumultuous period in the history of Portugal. The Portuguese monarchs lived in poverty relative to the monarchs of Europe. This war between Dom Miguel, who became King Miguel, and Pedro bankrupted the treasury. It left the Royal Navy existing only on paper and created a great deal of foreign debt. Over history, whenever the royals of Portugal had enough disposable income, they gave outsized gifts to the Vatican, as if in competition with the French in endowing the Vatican as a token of their loyalty to the church. And then, of course, the Inquisition exported, basically cast out their entire commercial class. So the wealth that the explorers, that the outposts of the world brought back to the royals enabled them to purchase what goods they can from the English, from the French, and even from the Spanish. But the locals, the people of Portugal, rarely benefited and were existing as best they could. So in 1832, in this War of Brothers, otherwise known as the War of Spanish Succession, Forrester arrived, and he looked at the Portuguese people, and he said, "These are sympathetic souls, hardworking, hospitable, generous, and that Portugal was neither a commercial nor a manufacturing nation. He noted that people cut trees as they needed them, but trees were not replanted. People lived in subsistence farms with minimum nutrition, living and working in feudal estates where women were compensated half as much as men. And despite the available land, there was minimal farming. Portugal in the mid 19th century had half the population of Ireland and farms that were 1/13 the number of farms then existing in England, despite the available land for farming. There were no roads connecting any major cities, there were no large towns, and rather than mine coal, the royals were purchasing coal from England. During the Roman era, in the 3rd century, the Romans had a presence in Portugal, and they made better use of Portugal's resources than occurred in the 19th century. The Romans had coal mines, which were abandoned. The Romans traveled on roads, while the Portuguese in the 19th century traveled on rough paths, using wooden plows to farm, and no way to reach market centers, no sort of little towns, larger towns, methods of exchanging goods simply did not exist. Even the king could not travel by road 30 miles outside of Oporto. And in 1853, a line was begun, a train line, and it went from Lisbon 20 miles north before being abandoned. You're looking at the train line in the building of 1856. This is the train station in Lisbon, and you'll see again this Manuelian architecture. Beautiful train station, but the tracks did not connect the two largest cities in the mid 19th century. So, when Forster arrived in Portugal, and it was in the onset of its civil war, Americans think of civil war and slavery, but this was a civil war between the Miguelites, that is, the nobles, and the Pedroites, the constitutionalists. And you're looking in this woodcut at the noble Miguelites who did not work, dumping port wine into the Douro River to disrupt any commercial success of the Pedroites. You might know that in 1832, it was still against the law for nobles to live in a commercial city. In the history of Portugal, nobles could not be associated with anything of commercial value, commercial structure. Finally, in 1503, King Manuel again removed criminal penalties for nobles involved in commerce. But there was still a great social stigma, and there was the custom that nobles did not work. So this civil war challenged the ancient noblesse, the court society, with the noblesse moderne, the aristocrats of talent and wealth. A middle class was beginning. Politicians and merchants arriving from the people. And I'm showing you a little picture of sort of entrepreneurs, little cottage entrepreneurs. And note the colored cloth. That was revolutionary because in classic Portugal, people were relegated to wearing dark colors only. Let's step back just a moment before I come into our hero. The seeds of the economic revolution triggered by Forrester in the mid 19th century began with the Methuen Treaties of 1703, the father and son team from England. And these treaties opened England to Portuguese wine and Portugal to British wool. In 1673, just before these treaties, sumptuary laws that banned wearing any clothing except black were lifted, and laws that outlawed alcohol except for religious purposes were rescinded. By 1702, there were 23 Jesuit colleges, some of which produced port wine for general consumption. Now, the Portuguese royals, had general disdain for anything French. The Methuens were not Catholic, but they were not French, so they did have some credibility with the royals. Britain and Portugal negotiated a favored nation trade status, and they both began to export items between them, textiles and wine. They also agreed to combine their efforts at sea to unite against the French corsairs, these elegant, really pirates of the sea that would attack any vessels going from Portugal to England. So, of course, the French were furious when they learned of the treaty. They accused the Methuens of bribery. The elder McEwen was recalled to England and replaced by his son, but the treaty stayed. One other character I should mention as a backup to our story is the Marquis de Pombal. In his glory days, he repaired Lisbon after the earthquake of 1755. The earthquake leveled Lisbon, and the royals were absolutely frozen, not knowing what to do. And the Marquis stepped forward and said, "Bury the dead and feed the living." He took charge of literally rebuilding the city of Lisbon. And as he consolidated his power, he cast the Jesuits out in 1758. They were threats to his power. And so he accused Jesuits of being involved in an assassination attempt on the king. His idea was to control the country, and certainly he had great control over decisions made by the royal family. From about 1770 to 1779, it said that he enhanced his autocracy at the expense of liberty. And notable of all of that was the Douro Wine Company, which he created in 1754. This was the largest nemesis to Forrester because the Marquis, who knew nothing about making wine, set all the rules, including the rules for making Portuguese wine. So when Forrester arrived in Portugal, the rules of making wine were to use all fruit. Frugal, waste not ethics said that all grapes would be used, whether they were ripe, rotten, or green. And all berries would be harvested and combined in the vats. So elderberries were included. It gave the wine a rich, deep, sweet red juice. The Portuguese thought that the English enjoyed their wine red and sweet. And so, although some of the vintners would make wine in the French style, they did so for their private use. And occasionally they would sell it on the sly, not as part of uh, the marquis's knowledge. They would sort of sell it in the back market. And so this is what Forrester faced when he arrived in Portugal. The wine that was labeled first class was the most adulterated and made for export. So the Douro River Valley, which is now a World Heritage Site, every aspect of wine production, from the growing of grapes to the harvesting of grapes, was controlled by the Royal Oporto Wine Company. They had the authority to collect taxes from the people and ostensibly use those taxes to build roads. They were efficient at collecting taxes, but not so attentive to building any sort of roads. So later, in 1853, when the power of this wine company was reduced, Forrester considered this one of the most positive impacts to making really good wine. As he said, the company was the greatest single impediment to making good wine. It was a victory for Forrester when the monopoly was removed. And he wrote of all of the sort of opportunities that were being missed by Portugal in making fine wine when he wrote a word or two on port wine. And then he wrote a word or two more on making port wine, and a word or two reiterated. And he would bring these essays to the English who appreciated what he was saying, but to bring the vintners, to bring the growers into line in Portugal was a huge task. So let's look at Joseph James Forrester's perfect port, because he was concerned that the Portuguese were making bad wine from good grapes. And he preached that a harvest of good grapes could be increased in two ways. One, better cultivation of the vineyards, and second, elimination of the Oporto Wine Company. As he said in 1853, we are on the eve of great change with regard to the quality of wine. We are, as we are with respect to our social, political, industrial, agriculture, and commercial affairs. He saw himself sitting on the eve of change, and to make good wine would facilitate that change. Now, in the 19th century, as today, port wine is marketed through shipping lodges in Oporto. Forrester inherited an interest in Offley's Forrester and Company, a company begun in 1761. His uncle joined the company in 1803. And over time, with Forrester's input and the improvements to sort of horticulture as well as winemaking, the number of houses, the number of port wine houses increased. The husband of one of his friends, Dona Antonia Adelaide Ferreira, a wine label that we recognize today, said of Forrester that to him the Portonians owe the elementary notion of paving the streets. The Duchess of Douro, his widow, Dona Antonio, was widowed at a point when she had two young children left with the wine estate, and she turned to Forrester and listened to his suggestions for both growing the grapes and when to harvest the grapes and make wine. And with her success, she expanded her estates to be the largest single landholder in the Douro. Note her dress, by the way. This is what we would call Victorian style of dress, but that dress is going to come back at the end of our story. So note the style of the full skirts with the heavy, stiff crinolines. Now, for Forrester to relax, he would take his watercolor paints on one of his boats and go down the Douro and paint what he saw. He painted people working in the fields, he painted the boats on the river, and he basically mapped the river as you see here. He created a 10-foot by 2-foot map of the wine districts that were burgeoning in the Alto Douro during the time that he was there. When he first arrived, British consumption of port wine was decreasing. But with Forrester's work, the visibility in England increased. The interest of the British in what he was trying to do to increase the quality of the wine took hold in England, and the number of port wine houses increased. Wine houses in the Douro grew to over 16,000 during a critical 3 decades of Forrester's impact on the industry, literally creating a domestic economy where none had existed before. It was Forrester's conclusion that the size and quality of the grape harvest would increase if wine was made according to soil conditions and using the optimum plants instead of a uniform custom as decreed by the Porto Wine Company. Forrester had specific suggestions for grape growing. He thought that if you trellised the vines in armadas to support the vines, it would lend itself to better, fuller grapes. And you would section the grapes by varietal in the vineyard, planting Bordeaux-style grapes. And you would harvest the grapes when they were ready, not when the Royal Oporto Wine Company said they were ready. You would pick the optimum grapes, not throw everything in the vat, whether it was green, ripe, or rotten, as the Oporto Wine Company would have you do. Forrester's harvesters worked in shifts to bring the grapes in at their optimum point before they would rot. What Forrester did is hire a bagpipe and drums to keep the lines of harvesters moving with their baskets. He uprooted the elderberry trees. There would be no adulteration of Forrester's port. And so the result was a pure red wine with more body than Burgundy. Forrester must have been delighted when he confounded the wine classifiers with his Portuguese wines, so they were simply known as port. Now, Forrester was a devotee of Justus von Liebig, a man born in 1803, lived to 1873, a contemporary of Forrester. He was a German chemist, and he isolated nitrogen as the key ingredient of plant nutrition. He was known as the father of fertilizer. So, von Liebig said of alcohol and wine that alcohol stands high as a respiratory material. It enables man to make up the deficient power, but at the expense of his body until there's an inevitable bankruptcy of his body. But wine, said von Liebig, is a restorative, a means of refreshment, a means of correction and compensation where misappropriation may occur in nutrition. It was a means of protection against transient organic disturbances. He's telling us that there are no organisms in wine that would be unhealthy for us. And so said Liebig, wine is surpassed by no product of nature or art. Now, the locals feared Forrester's departure from the known cultural patterns of life, and he was initially vilified by the locals who feared change. And he was also a great threat to the Oporto Wine Company. Fortunately, by 1853, there were enough Oporto wine lodges who appreciated Forrester's horticulture and winemaking success to want to emulate his efforts. Eventually, the Portuguese government acknowledged Forrester and made him a baron, the first Englishman to ever be made a baron in Portugal. But they honored Forrester all the more when they reduced the taxing authority of the Royal Oporto Wine Company and took away the monopoly. The Reform Club of London gave Forrester an award for his essays on Portuguese economics, which he stretched into 4 published volumes. So, Forrester was 52 and at the height of his success in 1861, when he decided to host a boating party for some of his friends. Now, his large boat that would be used to take the barrels down the Douro to the lodge was in for repairs. So he decided he would use his smaller boat to entertain Dona Antonia Adelaide Ferreira and Baroness Fladgate as they went down the Douro to the estate of Taylor, Fladgate, and Yeatman for a picnic, accompanied by, of course, excellent wine. When their picnic was done and they loaded the boat and were back on the Douro returning home, the winds increased and the rapids were too much for the small boat. The boat capsized and went under the water. The ladies were thrown clear. Can you imagine them flying in the air, landing upright on the water, and floating down the current in those large skirts with those stiff crinolines, which brought them over to safety? But Forrester was wearing a money belt. He was known for paying his workers in gold coin, which he wore in a belt around his waist, and he was going to pay them later the day. And so when the boat capsized, Forrester slipped below the surface and drowned, dragged to death, as you might think, by his success. Some of the vines planted by Forrester thrive in the vineyards of the Alto Douro today, some at the estate of Quinta Boa Vista. And there's a Portuguese bread and breakfast chain known as Poussadas, and one of them, Alhajo de Forrester, sits proudly and overlooks the Douro. But the economic and horticulture impact of Joseph James Forrester can be seen across the Douro Valley today. You can see it in the docks, the paved roads, the number of port wine houses, and in every glass of fine port wine. Port wine is a major industry of Oporto today. So you might go to one of the port wine tasting houses, enjoy a glass of wine. When you do, raise your glass and toast your benefactor, Joseph James Forrester. Enjoy your time in Oporto, the port of ports. So many ports, so many stories. Thank you for being with me.